Imagine a conflict not between two distant armies, but between neighbors, friends, and even family. The American Revolution is often cast as patriots fighting a distant crown, but it was also a civil war. Roughly 1 in 5 colonists remained loyal to Britain. Today, we explore why, and we delve into 2 brutal reminders of how far passions ran: the torture of Customs Officer John Malcolm in Boston, January 1774, and the maiming of Georgia landowner Thomas Brown in August 1775. We'll trace the path from colonial grievance to full-blown guerrilla warfare, and conclude with how France and Spain helped tip the balance toward American independence. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with Britain victorious but bankrupt. To help pay war debts and finance colonial defense, Parliament levied a series of taxes on the colonies. The 1764 Sugar Act lowers molasses duty but enforces collection. The 1765 Stamp Act was the first internal tax on all printed materials. This act and the slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for colonial resistance because the colonists believed that only their own elected legislatures had the right to impose taxes. And the 1767 Townshend Acts, with duties on tea, glass, and paint, all incur revenue to pay royal governors. By late 1773, unrest had morphed into direct action. On December 16th, Bostonians dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the harbor. The shockwave spurred the intolerable acts closing Boston's port and revoking local self-government. Yet not every American colonist cheered rebellion. Loyalists, about 15 to 20% of the population, had their reasons. Number 1 being economic ties. Merchants and landowners feared disruption of British trade. 2. Cultural loyalty. Many identified deeply with British legal traditions and the monarchy. 3. Fear of anarchy. Patriots' radicalism suggested mob rule, while loyalists preferred order even if it was under a distant king. And finally, number 4, social position. Office holders, Anglican clergy, and those benefiting from the crown's patronage resisted change due to their wealth and status being disrupted. On a frigid January night in 1774, Boston witnessed a chilling spectacle. John Malcolm, British customs officer and enforcer of the hated Townshend duties, would pay a grisly price for his colonial ire. John Malcolm, a recent customs appointee, was known for his arrogance. He struck a patriot rope maker, George Hughes, with his cane and possibly knocked him unconscious. A few hours later, Hughes and a group of the Sons of Liberty surrounded Malcolm at his house on Brattle Street. They dragged him into the night. Malcolm was stripped to the waist and covered with burning hot tar and feathers before he was forced into a waiting cart. Some men cheered while he was being burned with tar, others tried to stop the chaos and suggest that he be turned over to authorities instead of enacting vigilante justice. They forced him onto a cart and paraded him through Boston's streets, hurling jeers. At each tavern, they made him gulp strong tea from the East India Company, mocking his role in imposing that very tax. Finally, they compelled him to curse King George III. Under threat of further mutilation, some accounts speak of severed ears, and Malcolm finally complied. Malcolm was spared his life that night, but politically it sent a clear message. Patriots would no longer tolerate royal agents. For loyalists, it was a sign that colonial resistance could turn savage. Within weeks, Malcolm recuperated and fled to Britain, leaving him scarred and humiliated. Just 3 months after Malcolm's ordeal, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord. The revolution had officially begun. April 19, 1775, the shot heard round the world. Continental Congress organizes an army and George Washington is appointed commander. And loyalist units begin to form around British garrisons in New York, Boston, and Charleston. Meanwhile, down in Georgia, a clash of loyalties produced an equally shocking brutality. Thomas Brown arrived from England in 1774, a wealthy landowner. His outspoken support for the crown earned the enmity of local patriots. In August of 1775, a gang calling themselves the Liberty Boys surrounded Brown's house. They beat him with musket butts, whipped him with leather straps, and tore the flesh from his scalp. His bare feet were placed on red-hot coals until soles blistered and cracked. The Liberty Boys tried to force Brown to renounce his loyalty to the crown. When he refused, he was tarred and feathered just like John Malcolm a year before him. Miraculously, Brown survived, but he was irrevocably changed. Swearing vengeance, he fled through hostile territory to British-held East Florida. There, he raised the King's Rangers, a mixed force of loyalists, enslaved people promised freedom, and Creek and Seminole warriors. Brown and his men became known as the Scalp Hunters. Leading frontier-style raids, he and his rangers ambushed Patriot supply convoys along Savannah Road. They burned homesteads suspected of harboring rebels, and they collected leather scalps as proof of service, an atrocity fueling frontier terror. But Patriot leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, adopted similar guerrilla tactics. Francis and his men were very successful using hit-and-run ambushes in the Low Country. They harassed British foraging parties using swift, stealthy strikes and melting back into the wilderness unseen. This back and forth of frontier terror blurred the lines of civilized warfare. Neither side spared civilians, and reprisals only stoked further violence. By 1778, the British hoped to exploit Loyalist strength in the South, but they faced a growing problem: full-blown World War. France joins war efforts in February 1778. Motivated by revenge for the 7 Years' War, France signs the Treaty of Alliance with the United States. French ships arrive in Newport, Rhode Island. Spain enters the war in June 1779. Under Bernardo de Galvez, Spain assaults British posts along the Gulf Coast, Pensacola, and Mobile, threatening British supply lines from the West Indies. And in 1780, the Dutch War begins, largely stemming from disagreements over Dutch trade with Britain's enemies during the American Revolutionary War. The war resulted in significant losses for the Dutch, but also spread Britain's troops and supplies even thinner. Suddenly, British resources are stretched across Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. The hoped-for Loyalist uprising in the South fails to materialize at scale. Many Loyalists, cowed by Patriots' violence or their sheer ambivalence, refuse to join. In October 1781, after years of fighting, British leading General Charles Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, trapped by Washington's army and the French fleet. Though scattered fighting drags on, the die is cast. In September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ends the war. For Patriots, it is victory; for Loyalists, catastrophe. In Massachusetts, New York, and Georgia, legislatures confiscate Loyalist estates. An estimated 60,000 to 80,000 Loyalists depart for Canada, the Caribbean, or back to Britain. Thomas Brown settles in the Bahamas, and John Malcolm remains in Britain, forever marked by his Boston ordeal. The American Revolution was not simply a struggle against a distant king. It was a fracture of community bonds, a civil war waged in parishes and backcountry farms. The fates of John Malcolm and Thomas Brown remind us of the Revolution's dark underbelly: torture, mutilation, and vigilante justice. Yet their stories also underscore the depth of conviction on both sides. Patriots driven by the dream of self-rule, Loyalists by tradition, loyalty to the crown, and fear of the unknown chaos of a new era. As the war's final chapters were written with French and Spanish aid, the new nation emerged, scarred, divided, but independent. In the rubble of that conflict, the American promise was forged. Thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. This has been Deadliest Disasters.